Welcome, everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce today Lieve Van Hoof. Lieve Van Hoof is a research professor at Ghent University in the Department of History and associated with the Department of Literary Studies. Being trained in classics, history, and political science, Lieve obtained a PhD at KU Leuven in 2006 with a thesis entitled The Social Dynamics of Philosophy, Reading Plutarch's Popular Philosophical Writings. Before coming to Ghent, she held positions at Oxford and Exeter and at Bonn and at Göttingen. In 2017-19, she was co-chair of the ugent.academia, whereas in 2021, she received the award of Laureate of the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium for Science and the Arts. Her work addresses mainly the social-political role of Greek and Latin literature under the Roman Empire from the 1st to the 6th century. And currently, one of her projects examines Greek and Latin letters to understand how lobbying worked in late antiquity. Amongst her many publications, I would like to mention the monograph Plutarch's Practical Ethics that stems from a PhD, and the volume Libanius, A Critical Introduction, dated 2014. She also co-edited two works with Peter Van Uffelen in 2020 that are the Clavis, Historicum Antiquitatis Posterioris, and the Fragmentary Latin Histories of Late Antiquities. Today, Lieve will present a paper entitled In Cauda Venenum, the End of the Libanius Letter Collection and Foerster edition. Lieve, the floor is all yours.
Very much, Georgia, although I must confess I couldn't hear a lot of what you were saying, but then I mean for me that's no problem because I guess the bits I did catch were about my career, so I know what I did in the past, and I assume you said only nice things, so thank you very much, and thank you to all the conveners for inviting me to this TeTra seminar. Very happy to be speaking to you at this seminar because as Georgia may or may not have said, I'm currently mainly working on the letters of Libanius, and eventually I'm working towards a monograph on the letters of Libanius. Now, due to several reasons, which I will come back to briefly afterwards. The main reason being that there is a very good critical edition available. Due to these reasons, scholars of Libanius hardly ever look at the manuscripts. And the TeTra seminar is, of course, a perfect environment for talking about what is to be gained when we do look at the manuscripts. And so in the next 25 minutes, I hope to make a case for looking again at the manuscripts, notwithstanding the presence of a very good edition by Richard Foerster. And I really want to make the point about what can we gain if we do look at the manuscripts. And I'll do that by using the very end of Foerster's edition as a kind of case study. So if possible, then I'd like to share my screen. Let's hope that that works. Yes, now, yes. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, that's fine, because I don't see anybody.
We can't see yet the presentation.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fine.
We cannot see.
You cannot see the presentation.
No, not just yet. It has not come through.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
We
if
do.
You could make it. Yes.
Yes, can you still see it?
We do.
Beautiful.
Okay,
thank you.
then we're all settled. And now I can see you. I can see you too. Okay, right. So my paper will be about the letters of Libanius. For those of you who might not be familiar with him, Libanius was a sophist and also a professor of Greek rhetoric who lived in Antioch in the 4th century AD. He was not a Christian, he was a pagan, but notwithstanding that fact, we have conserved of him 64 orations, 51 declamations, lots of progymnasmata, and more than 1,500 letters. Now, with more than 1,500 letters, Libanius is the largest letter collection from, or largest classicizing letter collection from antiquity. The other thing you need to know about this letter collection is that it falls apart chronologically in two periods. So the letters cover, on the one hand, the years 355 to 365. And on the other hand, the final years of Libanius's life, namely the years 388 to 93. As a testimony to their popularity, one element is that these letters were conserved in more than 250 Greek manuscripts, as well as in several translations. All these manuscripts were studied by Richard Foerster, and in the 1920s, Foerster published his complete Teubner edition, which consists of two large volumes containing the letters and one introductory volume. Foerster surely did a great job. So he studied all the manuscripts, most of them himself. And in contrast to other late 19th and early 20th century editors, Foerster did not reorder Libanius's letters chronologically. And of course, now we think that that's a very big advantage, that we can see the letters as they were transmitted by the manuscripts, rather than reordered as modern scholars at the beginning of the 20th century loved to see them. Yet, however valuable his edition, it is not perfect. So in this presentation, I return to the manuscripts to show that the end of Foerster's edition is highly problematic. As such, this will bring research on Libanius's letters in line with research trends in philology, where New Philology's material turn has emphasized the importance of individual manuscripts, not just as transmitting material, but also as unique artifacts worthy of study in their own right. And it will also bring this in line with the field of ancient epistolography, where scholars now emphasize the importance of letter collections and the story these collections tell, in addition to individual letters. I shall proceed in 5 steps. So first, I will introduce to you the 3 main manuscripts transmitting Libanius's letter collection. And discuss what the end of the letter collection looks like in these manuscripts. And then I will discuss the 5 last letters in Foerster's edition. And as you will see, each of these letters has its own individual story and history in transmission. And I will make different points about each of these letters. So I start with the end of the letter collection as transmitted in the manuscripts. So I said before that more than 250 manuscripts transmit, Greek manuscripts transmit letters of Libanius, but the core of this manuscript tradition is actually it boils down to 3 main manuscripts, namely the Vaticanus Graecus 83, named V, which dates from the 11th century and which has by far the greatest number of letters, so 1529 in total. V dates from the 11th century, but about half of it went lost very soon afterwards and was rewritten by various other hands, large parts by a second hand, but also a third and a fourth hand worked at V. And then the other 2 main manuscripts are the Vaticanus Graecus 85, termed VA, and the Vossianus Graecus 77, termed VO. They are slightly later. The Vaticanus Graecus, so VA is almost contemporary with V. The Vossianus is slightly later. As you see already on the PowerPoint, I've put VA and VO a bit more closely together because these 2 manuscripts, they share a lot of features. Most notably, the fact that they both contain, or at least originally contained, for sure, we know that 1112 letters, and it's the same 1112 letters in both manuscripts. Now, if we compare well, the other thing which VA and VO share is that they present the letters, these 1112 letters, in the same order. However, if we compare the order of the letters in VA, VO to that of V, we see that there are major differences. So you don't need to memorize the details, but I'll tell you a few striking characteristics which are worth memorizing. So all three manuscripts, as you see, when I write here book one, that's because in the manuscripts it says book one in front of those letters. So in the case of VO, that's letters 19 to 96, for example. So all three manuscripts divide the letters of Libanius into books, but these books look very different in V compared to VO. I start with V. So as you see, each of the books of V contains exactly 300 letters. So that's why I write roughly letter 1 to 310, but there are exactly 300 letters in that book, and the same for all the other books, except of course for the last one, which just contains the remaining letters, so not very many. In VA, by contrast, books contain a varying number of letters. The other thing to notice is that where all three manuscripts are available, several large series of letters, often spanning more than a book, occur in virtually the same order. So I call these letters, large series of letters which occur in the same order, I call them sequences. So for example, you see that letters 1 to 310 stand in front, stand at the head of all three codices. After that, however, you see that the order changes. So after letter 310, VA go on with letter 311, etc. Whereas in V, we first have letters 615, and only after some 300, after exactly 300 letters, then come letters 311 and following. So the letters stand in the individual letters often stand for large sequences, stand in the same order, but the order of these sequences is different in VO on the one hand and in V on the other hand. Now, two elements prove that the order of the letters in VA is the more original one. First of all, it is very easy to add a mechanical book division at a later point. So you just divide the letters up by in bunches of 300. Whereas it would make no sense to divide letters in books of a random number of letters at a later point. Second argument for the priority or for the rightness of the order of VO is that V actually contains a trace of the book division of VO, namely on folio 187. So as you see here, just this is the start, over here is the start of letter 311. You see that the second hand of V reads biblion triton. In the usual format and in conformity with, so the usual format, because all these 6 books in V have that format, and in conformity with the mechanical division. So this is really letter 311 is the start of book 3 in V as it currently stands. But if you look carefully, you see underneath biblion triton, where I've drawn the circle, you see that there is an older handwriting below, and that's maybe the element you can see most easily is a delta. It's a big capital delta, which you see here. So actually book 4, and that is exactly the place where letter 311, or which where letter 311 stands in VO. So V basically contains a reminiscence of the older book division as well. Richard Foerster saw this, and I think that he's definitely right in adopting the order of the letters as they occur in VO. But as I said before, VO contain only 1112 letters, so not all the letters that can be found in V. So what did Foerster do? He printed the letters in the order of VO and then simply appended at the end the letters that occur in V, but not in these 2 other manuscripts. And he numbered them 1113 and following up to 1544. Now, whilst this may be a logical placement, it means that Foerster's edition does not correspond to any existing manuscript. The order of the letters in his edition differs entirely from that of V, whilst the number of letters is significantly higher than that in VO. In other words, no historical reader ever read Libanius's letters in the way we do today. Instead, historical readers always ended their reading of Libanius's letter collection with letter 1112, or rather with the sequence 883 up to 1112. As you see. Now, in Foerster's edition, letter 1112 is just a letter in the midst of several hundred others. It just stands randomly in a long series. Yet, if we know, and if we take into account that 1112 was actually the last letter in all of our 3 manuscripts, then the letter becomes actually highly programmatic, not problematic, but programmatic. Now, I do have the text of the letter at the bottom of my PowerPoint if we want to go into details later, but I want to focus later on in the presentation on some other letters. But so you'll have to take my word for it for the time being. But as you see here, letter 1112 in fact shows striking resemblances with Libanius's autobiography, most notably both. And that's really at the head of the autobiography, and it's literally in this letter. Libanius emphasizes and literally discusses the fact that his is a mixture of good and bad fortune. It's not all good, it's not all bad, it's really a mixture. And what he considers his most important good fortune is the fact that his alumni are very successful. And that's exactly what is in the autobiography, and that's exactly what is in letter 1112. So this letter basically constitutes a perfect endpoint to this collection, and as it were, suggests that the letter collection may divulge the same message to the audience as does the autobiography, which would make sense for a last letter in a letter collection. So, whereas the main manuscripts are unanimous in presenting the sequence 883 to 1112 as the end of Libanius's letter collection, Foerster, after letter 1112, added the letters that were transmitted in V, but not in VO, VA. In his edition, these are letters 1113 to 1544. As I shall demonstrate in the remainder of my presentation, the last 4 letters, so 41 and following, do not belong where they stand. I shall discuss these letters, but first I wish to show that letter 1540 is actually also a real endpoint, a point of closure in the text. 2 elements can be adduced: the layout of the manuscript and the sense of closure provided by the contents of the letter. First, the manuscript. I apologize for the appalling quality of this reproduction, but even so, perhaps it proves my point, because even though the quality is appalling, you can see that letter 1540 here on the left hand side is written in the same way as the preceding letters. And you can also see that the ensuing letter on the bottom of that page, left hand still, it's still written by the same hand, but there is much more superscript there, and the layout is much less careful. It's a garbled layout. Now, this ensuing letter is actually in VO is letter 1047. So it has its place in VO in the middle of a completely different set of letters. So what this suggests is that basically the space after letter 1540 was first left blank, and that later this space was used to add a letter that had been forgotten, because indeed it is missing in this series. In V you also have letters 1046 and 48, but the letter in between there is missing. And so this place, which was left blank, was used to add that letter at a later point. Second argument why letter 1540 is the last letter of the sequence is the sense of closure provided by the letter's contents. Again, I won't go into details here about this right now, but this letter, 1540, very strongly mirrors letter 1113, so the start of the sequence. As you see here, both letters picture Libanius interacting with politicians. So he starts the letter by saying, I was sitting with Celsus, the governor, when your letter came or did not come, when a messenger from you came, etc. So he starts by sketching this kind of socially important and political environment. That's the first similarity. But then there is a big difference, because in letter 1113, Libanius suggests some disappointment. He says, I'm a bit disappointed because I did not get a letter from you. But I understand, he says, because I know you're very busy, you're an important man, and you didn't find time to write. Now in letter 1540, Libanius praises his addressee because although he is very busy and has many matters to take care of, he still found and made and took the time to write a letter to Libanius. So these two letters, the first and the last in the sequence, they mirror each other. So on the basis of these two arguments, the contents and the manuscripts, it seems likely that letter 1540 was the end of a sequence in V as originally designed, and then other letters were added later. So if 1540 was an endpoint, where do the other letters in Foerster's edition come from? Letter 1541 in V follows after letter 1540, as you see here on the right-hand side. I don't know, with me on my screen, your faces appear on the very right. Perhaps you should move them around a bit, because I numbered the letters on that right-hand side, and you can only see them if you move the pictures. So it does follow very shortly upon letter 1540, and we don't know exactly when 1047 was added, so perhaps it was the next letter written in the manuscript. But very importantly, it's important to look not just what it follows upon, but also which letters it stands in front of. So what follows after letter 1541. And what you see is actually that all the letters that follow upon 1541 are letters that stem actually from books 1 and 2 of the letter collection. So you first have letter 87, 90, 104, 134, and a few others. So 5 or 6 others, running up to letter 201. So this suggests actually that letter 1541 might also belong to book 1. And as you see, 87, 90, 104, etc. These letters all stand in the right order as they occur in book 1. Now, if you go and have a look at VO, then you see indeed that VO conserved the last 2 lines of letter 1541 just before letter 30. So rather towards the beginning of book 1. If we put letter 1541 back there in book 1, then it turns out to be the missing piece that makes several puzzles fit together. First of all, I'm going to move your faces back. Yes. First of all, letter 1541 helps to fill a lacuna. In the manuscripts, in all of our manuscripts, the individual letters are numbered. But between letters 29 and 30 in Foerster's edition, so when you look at these letters in VA and VO, the numbers they jump from number 11. So letter 29 in Foerster has number 11 in VO and also in VA. And letter 30 in Foerster has number 17. So numbers 12 to 16, in other words, are missing. There must be a lacuna. Now, given that VO has the last 2 lines of letter 1541 just before the first letter after the lacuna, yeah, it seems logical that letter 1541 belongs there. And it is completely unclear to me why Foerster, who pointed out that these 2 last lines of that letter are in VO, why he did not put that letter, print that letter there. second puzzle resolved by replacing letter 1541 in the first book. The correct placement of letter 1541 in book 1 allows for a better dating of that letter. Because on the basis of its place in V, shortly after letter 1540, scholars have traditionally, and also in Foerster, of course, it's just after letter 1540, scholars have traditionally dated letter 1541 to 365, to the year 365. If the letter it actually belongs to book 1, its likely date, because the letters in the books are largely chronologically close to each other, its likely date would be around 358, 359. And this actually makes for a much better fit with the other 5 letters addressed to the same addressee in Libanius' letter corpus. So the addressees of letter 1541 are a couple of brothers, Apollinarius and Gemellus. Now, in letter 1541, Libanius reacts to a letter which he has received from these brothers in which they have expressed their desire to come and study with Libanius, ton poton, as you see here, but they cannot fulfill that desire yet. And Libanius says like, oh, but it's great that you're showing this great interest, that you're showing this enthusiasm, hormé, that you want to make a start of getting to know me, of hormone. And he said, oh, don't worry, it will all be all right. You will take part in the future in rhetoric. Koinones, it's a future tense. So it's very clear that at this point in time, at the point in time of letter 1541, these 2 boys have not yet studied with Libanius. However, in all the other 5 letters in the letter collection of Libanius, it is very clear that they have already studied with Libanius. And so scholars have tried all kinds of theories to explain this away. For example, by saying that, well, actually, so they studied with Libanius first, and that's these other 5 letters. Then they were professionally active and actually at a quite high level for a couple of years. And then for some reason or other, all of a sudden, they desired to study with him again. Now, that's not, I think, when you can write that you will start the aphormon to start to know somebody, when you can make somebody's acquaintance. So if you date this letter to 358-59, then it fits perfectly in this whole series of letters addressed to these brothers. And it is addressed to them before they came to study in Antioch. So that's the second puzzle, which all of a sudden fits together if we place the letter back in book 1. A third puzzle to which letter 1541 provides the final piece is the identity of the addressee of letter 31. For letter 31, the manuscripts have not transmitted a name of an addressee. The only hint contained in the letter is that he was at some point a governor of Galatia. Now, based on this, and scholars have made different proposals. But I think that if you put letter 1541 back in the lacuna and just before letter 31, it becomes very clear that the addressee of letter 31 must actually be Anatolius IV. So the 4 refers to the PLRE, it doesn't matter who it is, but according to the PLRE, this Anatolius was a governor of Anatolia before 361, so it fits chronologically. But interestingly, this Anatolius was also the father of Apollinarius and Gemellus. Now, as you see here, this letter clearly talks about children in the future. So Libanius says like, well, it's a bit odd that you are already, but I understand it, that you're already sending the children of others, but not yet your own children. So he says, Pempon tapaidas heteron, tus sau tu melen. And it is tus, it is not just to paidion su. So it's your sons. So he's talking about sons in the plural. And he is also referring to the fact that they cannot yet come, but that they have sent him a letter. So it is describing letter 31, describing exactly the same situation as the situation described in 1541. And if this is correct, then we can also refine the PLRE's dating of Anatolius' governorship of Galatia to before 359. But in any case, we can conclude that letter 1541 belongs in book 1 and not after letter 1540, where Foerster printed. Let's turn to the next letter added by Foerster. That's 1542. This letter was transmitted in V only, and it is the very last letter in the entire manuscript. Now, if you think that therefore it might make sense to put it where Foerster put it, you should think back of the order of the letters in V, and you will see that although 1542 is indeed the last letter, it comes some 200 letters after letter 1540. So many letters between. It stands in a completely different part of the manuscript. And it stands there at the end of the manuscript as the last of a series of 6 letters, which were added by a third hand to the manuscript because they had been forgotten or elsewhere in the manuscript, or because this third hand thought that they had been forgotten, because 2 of the 6 recur elsewhere in fact. Now, as scholars have noted, letter 1542 is related to letter 17. Both letters are addressed to a man called Florentius, and both letters refer to Hokratistos Tatianos, the most powerful Tatianus. Both letters also seem not to have been included in Libanius's letter collection. They were both agglutinated, in the sense that the scribe of V agglutinated letter 1542 at the very end of his manuscript after 5 other letters had been added, and the scribe of VO agglutinated letter 17 after other letters had been placed before the actual beginning of the collection. Because it's a complex story, but because the individual letters are numbered, we know, and because there was these incipits of each book, it is very clear and beyond any doubt that book 1 starts with letter 19, and it's a very programmatic opening. It has number 1, it has this superscript biblion proton. So the letters that come before that were actually just put there because people found these letters and kept adding to that. So that's why I termed this a process of agglutination, because these 17 letters were added in bits and pieces, just like letter 1542 was added at the end. Now, if we realize that these letters were simply agglutinated, we can also correct their dating. I'm talking about 17 and 1542. Thus far, scholars have assumed that letter 1542 was written in 365. Why? Because they associate it with letter 1540. They just look at Foerster's edition, and 1540 and the preceding letters are indeed datable to 365. And then they said, like, okay, since letter 17 belongs together, then 17 also dates from 365. But if we know that letter 1542 in no way belongs close to letter 1540, then we should also give priority to other chronological indicators, in particular to the fact that Tatianus is called the most powerful, Hokratistos Tatianos. Now, if you look at the use of Hokratistos in Libanius's letters, it must refer to a very high office. And for Tatianus, that can mean either his tenure as Count of the Sacred Largesses, which he held from 374 to 380, or to his tenure as Prefect of the Orient, 388, 392. So this means that these letters should not be dated to 365, but at least 9 and possibly up to 27 years later. Now, if these letters date from the 370s or 380s, so his period as Comes Sacrarum Largitionum, then the simple answer to the question of its exclusion from the collection is that this period is not covered in the collection. So if these letters date from these years, okay, they were not included because simply the chronological cut was elsewhere. But if these letters date from 388 to 392, which is a very well documented period in Libanius' letter collection, then the question imposes itself why these letters were deselected. And that brings me to the final 2 letters added by Foerster. Letters 1543 and 44 were not transmitted in any of the three major codices we have discussed so far. They were transmitted in 7 codices only, and all these 7 codices are manuscripts that contain mainly Christian early Christian letter collections. Now, this transmission of these 2 letters of Libanius alongside these early Christian collections makes perfect sense, because these letters are addressed to 2 bishops, namely Amphilochus of Iconium and Optimus of Agdamia. These 2 were also correspondents of Basil of Caesarea, and the former, Amphilochus, was also a correspondent of Gregory of Nazianzus. And with these letters, Libanius congratulates Amphilochus and Optimus on their appointment as a bishop. Now, at first sight, it seems obvious why these letters were not transmitted as part of Libanius' letter collection. Given that the episcopal appointments of Amphilochus and Optimus date to 373, it is likely that the letters should be dated to 373-74, and that period is simply not present in Libanius' letter collection. But the question can, and I think the question should, also be turned around. Why were the letters of the years 365 to 388 not included in the collection? Surely many factors may have played a role. One can think of accidental losses, but then these losses must have happened very early on, as the letters, there is no traces of these letters. So that's very well possible, and I think that it will definitely have played a role. But what scholars have emphasized most since the 1960s is that these letters are missing because Libanius would have burned them in an act of self-censorship under the Emperor Valens. I'm not denying that people, and Libanius in particular, may have had to be very careful under Valens, but 2 arguments, at least 2 elements, make that self-censorship cannot be the whole story behind the gap in Libanius' letter collection. First of all, the letters do not resume in 378 or 379 or 380, so shortly after Valens passed away, but they resume only in 388. That is a full 10 years after the death of the Emperor Valens, and we have no evidence whatsoever that Libanius would have feared Theodosius or that Theodosius would have chased him. On the contrary. Second, if Libanius would have destroyed his letter archive out of fear that Valens would discover letters that were saying things that he shouldn't say, and it's not very efficient to just burn your own archive, because of course the emperor can always go and retrieve the letters from the letter archive of your correspondent. So because of these and a series of other arguments, I've argued in an article a couple of years ago that self-censorship cannot be the whole story behind the shape of Libanius' letter collection. And instead, I suggested that self-fashioning may have also played a role alongside accidental losses and perhaps self-censorship. What I adduced as an argument, or one of the arguments I adduced back then, was that the letters that were selected for inclusion, so letters 840, which is the first letter dating from the late period and following, that these letters stem from a period when Libanius has just been honored by a letter of the emperor. And as a result of that honor, he starts corresponding with a whole rooster of top officials in the Eastern Roman administration. So that may be a reason why these letters were selected for inclusion in the collection. Now I would like to suggest that letters 1543-44, conversely, may offer a clue as to why the years 365 to 88 were deselected from inclusion. For in these years, Libanius corresponded with several bishops, certainly with Amphilochus and Optimus, perhaps also with Basil of Caesarea, with Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa, Faustinus of Iconium, Dorotheus of Tyre. These are all bishops with whom we either, the last 2 we have letters with them, but not from this, from Libanius, but not from this period. For all the others, it has been suggested from the church historians onwards, that they may have correspondence with Basil, and there's a whole forged correspondence between Basil and Libanius available. So we know that he corresponded with these bishops, but none of the letters are included in the collection. Some of these bishops were or may have been former pupils of Libanius. So the letters of these years could well have shown, if they had been included, a very different Libanius, a Libanius whose most famous correspondents, as well as whose most famous alumni, were very prominent Christians. Now, it seems very difficult to me to imagine that later Byzantine scholars would have chosen to leave out exactly these letters where the great rhetorician Libanius corresponded with these great Christians. And that's why I think that these letters may have been deselected at a very early point in time. Now, surely certainty is beyond reach in this respect, but taking into account the manuscript tradition of the last letters of Foerster's edition has at least the advantage of posing the question. This brings me to my conclusion. However great the merits of Foerster's edition, the end of his edition in no way matches the manuscript tradition. Letters 1541 to 44 all have a different provenience in the manuscripts and were simply agglutinated by Foerster at the end of his edition. Although Foerster was clearly not the first person to agglutinate letters to Libanius' collection, for example, these letters 1 to 17, they must have been agglutinated there at a very, very early point. So although Foerster did not invent a new thing in agglutinating letters, the shift of attention from his edition to the manuscripts has turned out, I hope, to be worthwhile for two reasons. On the one hand, this shift to the manuscripts has allowed us to correct the dating of various individual letters, to add prosopographical data for individuals addressed and mentioned in these letters, and to reduce the lacuna in Book 1. On the other hand, the return to the manuscripts has led to a better understanding, I hope, of the contours of Libanius' letter collection, which no historical reader ever read in the form in which we read it today in Foerster's edition. Crucial to the selection of the collection seems to have been the projection of a certain self-image of a successful teacher connected to important people. This effect is reached both through the selection and deselection of particular letters and through the order in which the selected letters are presented to the reader, with programmatic letters at the start and end of various books and sequences. This, I hope, will open the way to further study not only on Libanius' letters, but also on his letter collection as a collection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope the others will join me in thanking you for this very interesting paper. We have plenty of time now for conversations. If anybody wants to jump in, either we're in a one screen territory, so raising the hand in any way will be helpful. Mara is our first, please.
Yes, thank you, Lieve. Thank you very much. It was incredibly interesting. I have a very stupid question coming out of complete ignorance and curiosity. So you showed us that there is a difference in the numbering of the letters, in the division of the books in V and VA plus VO. I guess my stupid question is there just merely a chronological order that dictates the books, like the selection of which letter goes into each book, or is there some kind of general, I don't know, a common topic or a common theme behind the creation of these books? So I saw that there is, like, I think it was in VAVO, there are only 6 books, whereas in V there is 7, I think.
It's the other way around. The other way around.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I mixed them up. So yeah, I guess my question is there anything else that dictates the well, the existence of books other than chronology? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, the book divisions in V are entirely mechanical. So they just V counts, the scribe counts, 300 letters, okay, end of a book, start of the new book. And he writes, this is the end of book 1, this is the start of book 2. In VAVO, the situation is different. So each book of VAVO, at least, well, let me say the first 6 books of VAVO, each of these books contains letters that most of which date from a very similar time. So almost they fall within the scope of more or less a year's time. But, and I'll come back to book 7 in a minute. So, but these first 6 books themselves, so each book has kind of tells a little story of what Libanius is going through in that 1 year, let's say. But these 6 books do not stand in the exact chronological order. Yeah, so they start in 358, go to 361, and then they jump back to 355 up to 358, basically. Then book 7 is actually not termed book 7, but an allos biblios, or a hetera archae in VA. And that book contains letters 615 to 1112, so it's much bigger than all the others. All the others have about 100 letters per book on average. There you have a book of 500 letters on its own. And the peculiarity about that book is that it contains letters both from the period 360, 365 and 388, 393. And where the last letter of 363 is 839, where the next letter starts, and there is no indication whatsoever that here starts a new book. So there is a chronological jump of 25 years between letter 839 and 840, but there's no indication whatsoever. So that tells me for sure that the book divisions in that last allos biblios or hetera archae are not the same, do not have the same refinement, or are missing, or something is different there from the first books. As for V, there, of course, I said, okay, the division in books is purely mechanical, but of course, the letters stand in a particular order, so the sequences largely also have letters of the same or of comparable periods together. So chronology is definitely is one of the most important elements playing a role in the order of the letters. But I think that actually there may be more design in the collection, so where this chronological, this by and large chronological order is kind of upheaved, that there may be more such elements of design than has usually been assumed. And to give you just one example, letter 19, which stands at the beginning of the collection, must stem from 359, 360. So it's markedly chronologically out of date in that first book, and it makes a very grand opening. It's basically Libanius saying to a prefect, so somebody really high up in the imperial administration, and he's basically insulting this man. So that letter is a good example because also it stands chronologically out of scope, and I think it's very problematic, and it's a very long letter in which Libanius explains on what grounds he praises people, on what grounds he scolds people, etc., etc. So it's highly problematic, but it's a good example because only in letter 80 and 81, so letter 19, then you don't hear anything about this man called Anatolius until you get to letter 80 and 81. And that is when slowly and bit by bit, piece by piece, we as a reader start getting the story of how Libanius came to be so angry with this man. So according to me, and that's basically a big part of the work I am doing and will be doing over the next couple of years, is to try and see what other principles are the guiding principles behind the way in which the letters have been arranged in the book, so in the order in which we have them.
Thank you very much. I'll throw a question of mine in. This is very interesting. I'm curious, with regard to the letter that got misplaced in the edition, I think 1541, and that you'd reassign to book 1, but it's not in the main manuscripts, right? In the free manuscripts. Is there any anywhere else in the manuscript transmission of the letters, bit of evidence that it was grouped or read or copied with the letters where you would rather place it?
That's a very good question. Just to put it straight, so letter 1541 was transmitted by V. We saw it on the sheet, or it's the first one on the right hand side. So 1540, then you had this interjected garbled letter, and then you have 1541, but that at a different point in the manuscript. And in VO, it was only the last 2 sentences were transmitted. So it is present. A part of it is the last part of it is present in VO. But the interesting part about your question, I think, and that's a really good question, is whether it is transmitted anywhere else in the manuscript tradition alongside letters 30 and 31, for example. But I would need to check it again. But I'm 99% sure that it is not, because had it been transmitted there, then Foerster could not have overlooked it. And I mean, I've been reading quite a bit about Richard Foerster these last couple of years. He's a fascinating figure. I find it incredible, really, what he did. But there are a few things which I really, really don't understand, because he published actually in 1876, he published an article saying like the last 2 letters of this, the last 2 lines of this letter in VO, they are the same as this letter in V. But then why did he not put it? Why did he not put it there? And there's no explanation whatsoever, not in the critical apparatus, not in the introductory volume, etc. So yeah, I don't understand why he did not do it, but he found it, and he looked at, I think, out of the 250 manuscripts, I mean, I've not counted it, but I think he must have looked at about 200 manuscripts himself. And the other 50, he asked friends to look at it. And so he, in this introductory volume, which I mean, in itself is already also not, I mean, it's a small Teubner volume, but not that small. He always thanks the people, and he mentions people who have inspected these manuscripts for him. And I would have expected him to mention it either in that volume or in the 1876 article, had he found it somewhere in another manuscript together. So no is the brief answer.
Yes, thank you, very interesting. I believe Madalina is next. Did I see? Yeah, please.
Hi, Madalina.
Thanks very much. That was really excellent and yeah, very helpful for my own work and interest. So yeah, I'm really very interested in this. So I have a question actually. Starting from the sequencing stuff and also a little bit about the self-fashioning. So I was wondering to what extent reconfiguring the corpus in the way you are suggesting modifies the epistolographic profile for Libanius, and does this image modify the epistolographic self then? So not only the profile, but also the epistolographic self, his self-fashioning. I think you already hinted about this, when you mentioned that possibly the letters to the bishop were rather not necessarily present in the main collections, but can you spell out a bit more the implications of this for the construction of the epistolographic self?
Yeah, the implications of what exactly for the epistolographic?
Of reconfiguring the corpus in the way you are doing.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, then perhaps first a footnote. So reconfiguring the corpus, yes, I think that the very end of Foerster's edition, these letters simply stand in the wrong place. The other thing that is important is to see that letters 1113 and following in no manuscript presents the letters in the order of Foerster, so they form a particular group, and for that particular group transmitted in V only, I think the important question is, what is the status of these letters? Were these letters which were actually deselected and which were retrieved later and just simply added to the corpus, to a collection which had been selected, or were these letters designed to be part of the collection? Other than that, I do not, I mean, it's not the case that I will go and write 10 articles showing that Foerster's edition is wholly wrong in terms of the order of the letter. So in the other respects, I do not want to reconfigure it. But I think it's very important that we keep in mind constantly that what Foerster presents is not what the manuscripts present to us. It's not the way historical readers read this collection. Now, as to the implications for the epistolographic self, I think that if we think much more carefully and much more about and have more attention for design and for books and for meaningful units in this mass of letters, because of course nobody reads this mass of letters from letter 1 to 1540 in, or even 1112 in one go. And I mean, you need to have structure as a reader. You need to have this structure, and that's what scribes offer when they present you sometimes a table of contents, but especially these incipits of the books. If we have attention for that, then we get to see more or a better view of what Libanius thinks is really important. And I think this letter 1112 is a good example, because, I mean, scholars have always read over it. I mean, it's just a letter in the midst of anywhere. I think the very first scholar who has ever mentioned, even just mentioned that letter is the recent edition with translation by Andrea Pellizzari. Of course, he discusses it because it's part of the series of letters which he translates, but that's the only thing. He has no special attention for it whatsoever. And I think if you start seeing that letters such as this one, which stand at the end of a sequence or of a book, that it helps to draw your attention to particular elements, such as, for example, in that case, the fact that Libanius takes great pride in his pupils, that he emphasizes this mixture of good and bad fortune. And I think that as a reader, if you kind of, I mean, a bit like Roy Gibson and Ruth Morello have shown for Pliny and others, it kind of invites the reader, invites you and me as readers to kind of reread what you have just read, the series of letters which you have just read, with particular attention for certain points. And the same, of course, and even a fortiori with opening letters. Of course, if the opening letter is about parousia, about showing how somebody speaks up, how a sophist, a simple sophist in Antioch speaks up to a prefect in very, very crude terms, well, that draws our attention to how does this sophist interact with other people? How did it come to be that he had such a row with this prefect, etc. So it kind of guides your reading experience. And I'm currently I'm going to give a paper in September where I basically try, and that's my first run through for my own book project as well, to see what the message or the narrative, narrative is a much better word than message, what the narrative is that is promulgated in each of these individual books. With the caveat that, of course, I realized that this book 7, so letters 615 up to 1112, that's a very big chunk. You can't treat that as one book. I mean, so I'm trying to look at what do these units say. Do they convey different self-images? Is there contradictions, or what kind of evolution, for example, do you see between the early Libanius and the late Libanius? And my hunch now, but again, I need to do further research into this, is that basically in the late period, in these letters, he he kind of makes the point that he's still very powerful, although the world has greatly changed, of course, between the 360s, let's say between Julian and Theodosius. The world has greatly changed for somebody who's a pagan professor of Greek rhetoric, with law studies becoming more important, with Christianity gaining ground, of course, with different career paths open, also without a formation in rhetoric in the imperial administration. And Libanius, I think, is still making the point that he is still very powerful. Although I very well realize that in these late letters, so the years 388 and 93, we also have three, very high profile, very spun out cases of lobbying, where Libanius actually, I mean, the first one he wins, the second one he probably loses, and the third one for his own son goes completely wrong. So he also admits that. And it's a very interesting mixture. And that's why I think it's so important to have attention for the fact that letter 11 and 12, so the closing letter, emphasizes a mixture of good and bad fortune, just like the autobiography, which is, of course, an interesting text to compare the letter collection to. So I'm afraid I don't have a very precise answer for you yet as to the contents, but I'm starting to kind of see some contours within which we could search for the answer, at least.
Very fine. Andy B from the dark will have a question.
I hope my connection will not act up. Otherwise, tell me if I'm breaking up. Thank you very much, Lieve. Fascinating talk. It's really fun to hear this kind of work and returning to manuscripts from editions. I wrote down in the beginning you mentioned translations. I was just wondering, did you mean ancient translations of Libanius, as in Latin translations of his letters?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah. I was wondering,
and Slavonic.
This is Slavonic as well.
But please, no. Well, okay.
I won't ask you about the Slavonic.
Now, I won't be able to answer any questions on Slavonic. Although I do realize that we have some people here who are able to do that. But, yeah.
I was just wondering if the transmission of, for instance, then the Latin translations, in the way these are transmitted, has this helped? I mean, probably not in this case because you did not mention it, but. Have you encountered cases where the transmission of Latin translations has helped you in this kind of process in determining the right position of certain texts, certain letters in the Greek, or?
No. Also because, as far as I know, so as far as Foerster has described it, there is no Latin translation which has all the letters. Although I might actually be, no, I'm not 100% sure about that. I should actually check it again. But what is very interesting is that in the 15th, I think, century, Zambecari translated the letters into Latin and also added several hundred letters himself. So he invented Libanian letters, and for a long time it was thought that these were letters which had really existed in Greek and Zambecari had translated and then they went lost. But Foerster, again, he did such a, that's why one of the reasons why I admire him so greatly, he definitively proved that these added letters, which we don't have anywhere else, that these letters are basically a forgery. And that again shows you the popularity of these letters, that even in the, I think it's the 15th century Zambecari, but around that period in any case, that how popular these letters remained even in the West.
Yeah, so
they haven't been of any help to me recently, and I must confess that I haven't looked at them in detail at all yet. Although I mean, it's definitely on my to-do list. It's interesting, and I've learned from reading work of several amongst you here present how interesting it can be to look at these different linguistic traditions and what kind of interesting work can be done with that. And that's definitely an inspiration for me for the future. So thank you for the question.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. If nobody has another question, I would have one. I find it very interesting. You opened saying at the beginning something along the lines that about the edition that no historical reader read Libanius letters as we do from these editions. It's very, very interesting, the division of letters. I can totally see, and I very much look forward to what you will write about the discourse and the narrative of every single book, especially the smaller ones where it's possible to assess that. But both, if I understand correctly, both types of numbering letters, of organizing books, are historical. None of them is modern. And what happened there? Because I can understand which one is older in this sense. I can see also a more recent person doing your bit of work and reorganizing into books chronologically and meaningfully. But the other reader, what did they do? Why did they go for the 300 by 300, the artificial one? What's happened there?
Yeah, my hunch, and that's largely based on Foerster, is that originally when V was first written, the book divisions must have looked very much like they did in VA/VO. So with books of with books of varying number of letters, and say of about 100 letters each. And the proof of that is that colored reproduction I showed you, where you see the Biblion Delta still beneath in the first hand. But that is as far as Foerster was able to reconstruct, and so I checked it with this reproduction. That's the only indication for that older division in V. However, as I said, almost half, actually really almost half of V went lost probably within 50 to 75 years after the production of V. And so then a second hand started restoring it. And then, of course, how do you make order in such a mass of letters? And I guess that's because the numbering and the division in sets of 300 has come from this second hand. I guess that's the point when this secondary division was introduced. The other interesting thing about, because we also know for sure that probably the letters in V in its original version were not exactly always in the same order as in VA/VO. And that, for me, that really raises the question of how does this collection work? So, okay, I've talked a lot about the books and the order in which they stand, and I've tried to demonstrate that the order in VA/VO is the more original one. But then how does it come that in the case of the transmission of Libanius, the order can change so much? How does it come that the books, even in VA/VO, do not stand in a chronological order? Perhaps that's not the intent, because perhaps that's really design. But then why is there no indication that a new book starts with letter 840, so when the late letters start, for example? And so what I've come up with thus far, a whole series of arguments which I'm developing in that direction, is that it's actually a much more open transmission history for Libanius' letter collection than, for example, for the letters of Pliny, which are always transmitted, as far as I know, always transmitted in the same order, and not just the same order of the letters within the books, but also the books stand in a particular order, and that order, in a sense, makes sense. Whereas for Libanius, I'm not so sure. So my hunch is that definitely book one was meant to stand at the head, but it's not this. The letters of Libanius did start circulating, divided into books, but did not start circulating in a particular order from this. It's very complicated. It's in one sense or another, it's more open than other letter collections. For example, also think of the fact that you have no introductory letter. Of course, it's difficult to know because we have no historical Greek letter collections which we can compare it to. Whereas for Latin, I mean, you have Pliny, you have Symmachus, you have Sidonius, etc., which all play and refer to one another in their introductory letters and explain that they have collected their letters and for such and such purposes, or in such and such ways, or in this or that style, and that's missing for Libanius. So in a sense, it's a more open tradition. On the other hand, I mean, it did, when it started circulating, it must have circulated in a certain order. And so my hunch, and I think that's what Foerster also suggests, is that will have been or may have been the order in which they are in VAVO.
Makes sense. Very interesting. Everything. Thank you very much. Georgia, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope the connection will hold this time. Small question, beside the book division and the order of the letters, do we also have significant textual variance between V and VAVO that can help us understand the relationship between and amongst this manuscript? Or the main division is just in the order?
No. In his I mean, the stemma is quite of course, I'm talking to people who are much more specialists of transmission history than I am. So the stemma, and this has only part of the manuscripts of the letters. It's quite complex stemma, and it's also based on the readings actually, which you get in the different manuscripts. But as far as I know, but again, I'm no specialist. VAVO. Compared to V in particular, so these three amongst each other do not offer revolutionary or very significant different readings. Or not, let's put it like that. They do not offer more interesting or more significant variants than they do with other manuscripts, if you see what I mean.
Well, with that, we'd like to thank you very much to our speaker today for a very interesting and informative paper, and wish everyone a very good rest of the afternoon. And thank you for joining us, and see you next time. It should be in a less summery month.
Thank you all very much.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye. Cheers.